Hello, and welcome to Communicating Science at the Benesky Museum of Natural History. I'm Annika Baldwin, an intern at the Benesky this summer and a biology student here at Amherst College. Today, I'm talking to Jill Miller, a professor of biology and environmental studies at Amherst. Her research focuses on the ecology and evolution of plant reproductive systems. She teaches classes on evolution and sexual reproduction. Jill is one of the professors who taught an intro biology course I took in the fall of 2020. I loved learning from her because her enthusiasm for plants and the rest of the natural world is infectious. She convinced me that plants are much cooler than I ever gave them credit for. I was excited for the opportunity to learn a little bit more about what she does at Amherst. In her free time, Jill loves gardening, hiking, and birding. Apparently, she's quite a juggler too. Hi, Jill. Thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to start just by asking, how did you first get interested in science?
Probably when I was about your age, maybe a little younger. I had an opportunity to work with a professor who had a research project going on in the Alpine. I went to undergraduate at Colorado College, and so I was able to get out into the field and hike up these mountains and look at these species of flowers that were growing on the tops of these mountains and think about how they managed up in that high elevation site. And I did that, I think, the summer before my junior year, got totally hooked. And then I did it again for my senior thesis. And I've never looked back. I knew then and there that's what I wanted to study.
Wow. So has it always been plant biology for you? You didn't have an idea for a career before?
It was always biology.
Yeah.
But I wasn't quite sure. I love the breadth of biology. So I would take, as you know, you might know, because a bunch of folks over in geology went to Colorado College or have affiliations with it. They're on the block plan. So you take one class at a time for 3.5 weeks. And that means that you can go to the field all the time. And so I took a field biology class, a field botany class, a field zoology class, an entomology class, an ornithology class. I took a bunch of geology, and we would go on these long field trips. And I just loved the natural world, and I loved the biological world, and I knew that that's where I wanted to be. So the specifics of where I wanted to work, I probably didn't even really cultivate till grad school, but I really loved working on that project up in the high Alpine on the species of primrose. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of fascinating reproductive system. So that's how I got hooked.
What made you enjoy it more than the other types of biology you were studying?
So I'm sort of intrigued with the patterns of diversity that you see in reproductive systems. And plants as a general group, flowering plants in particular, are remarkable for their diversity of reproductive systems. And so by that, you just imagine, a plant is sessile, it's stuck to one location, it can't get up and move around, it doesn't have complicated sensory systems or nervous systems to sort of assess who's around it. And yet a plant has to make a decision, so to speak, about with whom it's going to mate. And the challenges that plants face means that lots of really interesting solutions have happened evolutionarily. And I'm really interested in the transitions that happen and why they happen. What are the forces that cause particular plants to segregate sex or bring sex together or prevent mating with oneself? I just think it's really interesting. And I think it has to do with the challenges and thinking about how organisms can overcome the challenges that they face. And then beyond that, reproduction of any kind in biology, of course, is intimately tied to patterns of mating between individuals and then prevention of mating between different species. And so I'm also very interested in the connection of reproductive biology with patterns of diversification. So when do you get speciation and things like that? So macroevolutionary patterns that you see in the world.
Could you tell me a little more about what makes plant reproductive systems so diverse?
So again, I think it's related to their challenges, right? So they can't move, they can't really sense who's around them. They have what we call a modular structure, right? You and I have 2 arms, okay? But plants often, if you think about an individual genetic plant, an individual might have 100 flowers. And so those 100 flowers are each modules. And so that modularity creates a whole bunch of opportunities. Do you make lots of flowers or a few flowers? Do you put both male function and female function in the same flower, or do you separate that between flowers on the same individual? Mm-hmm. Or some plants go in for the animal mode, or at least the vertebrate animal mode, which is, forget it, let's just segregate and have male plants and female plants. So, I mean, I think it's the challenges of not being able to move around, of having modularity, and not having a sensory system such that plants end up manipulating animals to do their mating for them, right? And so they have all these adaptations associated with that, with those limitations. But it is true that people don't normally think about plants the first thing that they want to study, right? Animals are very charismatic, and you're watching a hummingbird visiting a plant. You're not really looking at the plant, you're looking at the hummingbird,
Yeah.
right? Which is doing the pollination. And I just think I like flipping the question around and thinking about it from both perspectives, right? The hummingbird is not there to help the plant, and the plant is not there to help the hummingbird. And yet you get these beautiful interactions between hummingbirds and plants in the ways in which and different traits have evolved. So it's, to me, I just love it. I just think it's amazing how the world ends up looking the way it does from these kinds of ecological interactions.
That's so cool. How did you, so after you discovered you loved this in undergrad, what did you do for grad school? Where did you go from there?
So I actually took a couple of years of gap years, and I worked as the position at Colorado College. I worked at Colorado College. It was called a paraprofessional, which I always thought was a funny name, but it was basically a glorified full-time teaching assistant. And so that was just super because, I had taken all these classes and really enjoyed all these classes at CC, but then I got to stick around and help the professors teach them. They would let me run a lab occasionally, or, I had to clean microscopes too, but I got to do all kinds of cool things. And I got to sit in on classes that I hadn't taken as a student. So I got, again, this breadth of experience across different biology. So I took a microscopy course, an SEM course, a scanning electron microscopy course, which I heard the geology department just got a brand new one. Ooh. Or they're getting one. I took bunches of genetics courses. I took a molecular biology course, as well as all those field courses that I talked about. I got to go to Jamaica on a coral reef biology class as a paraprof. So cool. And so, I mean, I just think, again, that sort of breadth has really enabled me to think a little bit about whole bunches of different kinds of evolutionary things, patterns that we see. I think I lost a thread there about gap years. So I took those 2 gap years. I got more experience in biology, and then I decided I really like not knowing the answer to things. Mm-hmm. And I say this to my thesis students and my summer research students every year. I say, research is about not knowing the answer. And if you're not okay with not knowing the answer, you're probably not going to enjoy the summer. And so you have to embrace not knowing. I really liked not knowing. I liked the freedom to think hard about what might be happening. Mm-hmm. And then I liked the creativity that you get in trying to figure out what's going on. And to me, that's research. And if you want to do research, you go to grad school. So I ended up in grad school at the University of Arizona in Tucson. So I went to the Sonoran Desert, which is gorgeous, and got to spend 6 years in Tucson working on my dissertation.
Wow. What were you doing out there?
So in Tucson, I didn't actually go with a project in mind. I started grad school knowing I had interests in plant reproductive biology, but not with a specific project. So I spent the first couple of years rotating around and learning what some of the PIs, the professors at the university, were doing, and spending a lot of time in the field looking for a project. And on a hike one day, I ran into this species, and it was in full bloom. It was gorgeous. And I opened up a flower and I looked at it and I thought, that's odd, because it had its male parts sticking way out of the flower, and it had its female parts didn't look quite right, and they were all down inside the flower. And I looked at several flowers on that plant and I thought, okay. And then there was a whole population there, and I looked at another plant and it had exactly the opposite features. It had its female parts sticking way out of the flowers, and its male parts were abortive and they didn't look like they had any pollen. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I wonder what's going on. So I collected a little bit of it. I brought it back to the herbarium, which is where you house plants, pressed plants. It's like a plant museum, and I ID'd it. And then I started looking up what people knew about it, and nobody knew anything about it. Nobody had ever documented anything strange about its reproductive biology. So I thought, well, gosh, let me look into that. So I started working. I did a little project on it for a couple of my classes, and I still study that genus of plants today. So I've been working on that genus of plants since the late 90s.
Wow. So you see this thing and you think, that's weird, but where do you go from there? How do you start coming up with a real research question, something that's testable?
Right. So what I was looking at there was just differences in the morphology of the flowers, right? The two flowers, they looked really different. And there were also different sizes. So the parts that had the male part sticking, the flowers that had the male part sticking way out were much larger, about 50% larger than the flowers that had the female part sticking out. So the first thing I did was go back, ID the species. I ID'd it as this thing called Lycium fromentii. Mm-hmm. And I looked up everything in the literature there was to know about this species. And nobody, again, had ever described it as having weird reproductive morphology. They just described it as a typical sort of hermaphroditic flowering plant. Most flowering plants are hermaphroditic, so they have both male and female function. And these plants had both male and female parts, but they just didn't look quite right. So then I thought, okay, well, maybe I ought to go find other populations of this species and look and see if other populations were also like that. So I started to do some surveys of populations and asking the question, well, you know, if 100 plants are flowering, how many of them have their male parts exposed and how many of them have their female parts exposed? And are all the flowers on a single plant the same, or are there both types of flowers on the same plant? Mm-hmm. Right. So I just started looking at the patterns, taking some data, and I learned pretty quickly that a plant looked either male or female, and that they were relatively equally distributed within a population. So if, you know, but I didn't actually know if they were male or female. They just looked like that, right?
Yeah.
So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was to do some crossing experiments to see, you know, were those things that had their male parts exposed, were they only male or were they hermaphrodites? Mm-hmm. Because they still had female parts. So I started doing some crossing experiments, and I just sort of went from there. And that group, that particular species, Lycium fromentii, actually is one species in a genus that has probably 90 species in the world.
Wow. And
so where it's pretty common in Mexico and the southwestern US. And so that's where I first met it and started to study it. And so I probably studied a handful, maybe 20 or so species down there in the Southwest when I was doing my dissertation, and found that in that part of the country there were three species that did this, that had what looked like separate sexes.
Interesting. So did you ever formulate an idea about why?
Sure. So most of the genus Lycium, okay, ancestrally, those flowers are hermaphroditic. Okay, so ancestrally in that group, it's pretty uncommon to have separate sexes in this particular plant family, which is in the tomato plant family. So I knew that what changes I was seeing in Lycium fromentii were derived, right, had happened later in time. And so I started to think about how I could test that. And so I decided to build an evolutionary hypothesis for the group. So I collected some genetic data and I built an evolutionary tree. And I could see on the tree where Lycium fromentii was. And I could see that it evolved from hermaphroditic ancestors. So I knew that any change that had happened in the lineage leading to that species. So that was actually very gratifying. Then the question becomes, if you know that the change is two separate sexes, well, what could drive that? Right? What evolutionary force could cause it to be advantageous to split your sex between plants as opposed to be a hermaphrodite? Mm-hmm. You know, one of the leading hypotheses for why that is the case is that plants which have both sexual functions can self-fertilize.
Yeah. And
when plants self-fertilize, they will often express something called inbreeding depression, which is a lowered fitness, right? The offspring of selfing are sometimes less healthy than the offspring from outcrosses. And if that force is severe enough, then it could be advantageous, for example, for plants to lose their male function, because then all of a sudden they can't do that, right? They can't self with themselves because they're just female.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as they can outcross with the other plants in the population, that should be stable. So that's one major hypothesis.
So then what's the advantage of having a hermaphroditic flower?
So a hermaphrodite, obviously, if a hermaphrodite might have, it's almost like a bet hedging strategy, Annika. So let's say that pollination, let's say that you need a pollinator, but pollination service is really poor in a particular year. Mm-hmm. Might be good to be a hermaphrodite, because if you're a hermaphrodite, you can try to outcross, but then you can self if you need to. And then you still have offspring.
But those offspring might not do so well, right?
They might not do so well, but in the event of low pollinator service or not any access to mates around you, that might be better. That might be the best strategy out there.
Oh, I see. Better than nothing, I guess. Huh.
In fact, there's a lot of animals that do this too. So there's snails are hermaphroditic. Mm-hmm. And or some snails, and I believe at the edges of their species range where they don't meet mates very frequently, they tend to self-fertilize. But in the middle of the range where snails are around each other, they tend to outcross.
Yeah, and that's different from just totally asexual reproduction, right? Where it's just a clone of yourself. So is there?
That's a good point though, Annika, because also at the edges of species range, you tend to find more asexuality than you do in the center of range. So the idea is very similar.
Interesting. So do you have to pick one or the other, whether you do like sexual or asexual reproduction, not just like selfing, but can a species just create like a clone of itself and have sexual reproduction?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Lycium reproduces, they're big shrubs, actually. They're big, long-lived shrubs, but they can reproduce by sending out runners and then having a new shoot come up. So they can persist vegetatively. And the plants, at least down in the Southwest, can be really old. They can be a couple hundred years old.
Wow.
So people have taken these like photographs from, early times, and you can see the plant. And then if you go to that same spot, you can still see the plant. It's pretty cool. There's some long-term photos that can do that.
So does it still count as the same plant though, if it's just a runner that's being sent out as opposed to a seed or something?
So if it's a runner from the plant, right, then it's genetic material. What do you think? Is it identical to the parent plant or is it different?
Well, it would be identical, right?
It's identical. So it's the same genetic individual. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Is it still connected to the original plant?
Sometimes it can stay connected underground, and then sometimes those can get severed because plants are also amazing, right? You can cut off a plant branch and stick it in dirt and it'll be fine. Right? Don't try that with your own arm. That's not going to work, right? But you can do that with plants. And so you can make cuttings from plants and propagate them that way.
That's so interesting. It's interesting too that, you can do that with some animals, obviously not in dirt, but like, I know starfish or other
sea stars.
Yeah, they can come back.
Same idea.
Do you know why they're able to survive when you cut them off while other animals can't, or other species?
Sure, it has something to do. It's with the cells. It's at the control of the level of the cells. So this plant cells are what we call totipotent. It's this fancy name, and it basically means that there are stem-like cells, stem cells in there that can actually give rise to multiple plant parts. So in other words, you could take some cell culture from, say, a carrot, put it on some medium, and it'll grow roots, even though it was like the orange part of the carrot.
Wow.
So so the cells retain the memory, I guess you could say, of creating different plant parts.
That's so cool. Well, to bring it back to you're going to teaching at Colorado College and then going to grad school. Assume you finish your grad school work and decided to look for a job. What was your first step after finishing your degree? Where'd you go?
So a pretty common trajectory is you're working to finish your PhD and you're looking for something called a postdoc.
Mhm.
So a postdoctoral fellowship somewhere or associate. And so I was lucky I got a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So I went back to Colorado. So I started in Colorado, went to Arizona, and then went back to Colorado. But this time I lived in Boulder, and I worked as part of in this particular project. I didn't get to design necessarily the whole thing myself, but I worked as part of. I managed a team of people to study a different group of plants and their reproductive ecology, mostly based on resources. And that group of plants was also in the tomato family in the Solanum genus, which is actually the same genus of the cultivated tomatoes that we eat.
Wow.
And so I had a huge greenhouse experiment that I designed there to study sort of the effects of reduced resources on whether or not a plant would produce female flowers or hermaphrodite flowers.
Oh,
And in
interesting.
that case, plants produced both types of flowers on the same inflorescence, on the same branch.
Mhm.
And so if you gave them more resource, they produced more female flowers. If you took away resource, they produced more staminate flowers or male flowers.
Oh, interesting. Why male when with fewer resources? I think would understand why it would pick have like individual sexes with more resources, you'd think, since like we were talking about with
So all the plants are hermaphroditic,
mhm.
but they either make female flowers or male
Oh,
flowers, right?
I see. Okay.
And so if you just think about a tomato fruit, yum, right? Tomato fruit is a pretty costly structure in terms of resources, right? It takes a lot of carbon and a lot of water to make, and a lot of sugar to make a tomato. So only these female flowers make these fruits. So if you give plants resources, they're better able to make more fruits, right? If
Yes.
you take resources away, they don't make as many female flowers because they can't quote unquote afford it, but they produce male flowers. And then male flowers, of course, pollinate other plants.
Okay.
So they're still gaining fitness, they're still gaining offspring, but they're not doing it through female function, they're doing it through male function.
All right. So what's the advantage of really ever having female flowers then if you can use fewer resources and just spread? I mean, obviously somebody has to be female, but
That's a great question, and you just answered it. You just said, well, obviously somebody has to be female, right? So if every plant in the population was focused like that, right? That, in other words, trying to make male gametes just so they didn't have the cost of female function, that would only work if there were females in the population. So it's a frequency dependent problem, right? So as soon as there's too many male producing plants, then selection's going to favor females, because it'd be great to be a female in that population where you had lots of access to pollen.
Mhm. Yeah, I was wondering, since if in situations with greater resources everybody tends female, then you would have the opposite problem, right? But you're saying that if that's the case, it selects for the opposite, even so.
So that's the beauty of evolution, right?
Yeah.
In small time scales, is that it's dynamic, it's always changing, and frequency dependence is a really important kind of selection that maintains sort of both, or maintains diversity in the population, both types in this case.
So do you think if you kept forcing these plants into resource depleted situations, would you ever see it sort of start to switch where it's maybe selecting for female plants instead, so that there's just any female individuals present?
So you can do these kinds of things in the field by manipulating the sex ratio in populations, and you can demonstrate higher fitness for the rarer sex and things like that. So yeah, you can show it experimentally, which is pretty cool. The generation time of tomatoes is a little too long to probably do an artificial selection experiment, but you could certainly do it experimentally.
Huh, totally cool. Okay, so you were doing your postdoc there. How did you end up at Amherst?
So I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Mhm.
and then I went to Colorado College, then I went to Arizona, then I went back to Colorado. I started to apply for jobs and thinking, and then listening, the group I work on is really a Southwestern specialist in this on this continent, right? So I just was looking for jobs basically, right? And applied pretty broadly. I had, of course, I had traveled east of the Mississippi, but I wouldn't have ever predicted that I would have ended up east of the Mississippi.
Mhm.
But I was very lucky and I got a job interview at Amherst and I thought, okay, it was my first job interview. And I thought, I don't have anything to lose. I'm just going to ask a million questions because I don't really know what I'm doing, right? And see what this is like. And it was a great visit. I thought I was going to visit a place like Boston.
Mhm.
And so when I landed in Amherst, I'm like, hey, this is pretty nice. I liked the setting a lot. And the people I met who eventually became my colleagues were really, just interesting and interested in what I was talking to them about. I knew the reputation of Amherst and I just got lucky.
Yeah, that's so cool. Did you always want to be a professor?
I was pretty much convinced that I wanted to stay in academia, though I did know that I wanted to teach. And I think a large part of that was having gone to Colorado College and having these close relationships with professors. That's what I wanted to do. And I knew that from a pretty young age, actually. I knew that by the time I had graduated from college.
Cool. So did you, obviously you had some time teaching at Colorado College as well. Did you find you enjoyed working with students too? I assume so, since this is what you've chosen to do. But
I did actually, as I was finishing my PhD, but before I took my postdoc, I went and I taught a block at Colorado College as an instructor. So this
oh,
was
cool.
after my PhD, but before my postdoc. And I remember my advisor at the time saying, Jill, you're crazy. Don't go do that. And I'm like, no, I really think I need to get a little teaching experience if this is what I think I want to do for my career. And he's like, oh, you're crazy. But I must say, taking a class on the block plan, you're up every day at 8, you're in class from 9 to noon, and then you go to lunch, and then you come back for lab from 1 to 3. That's tough enough as a student. Oh my goodness, preparing that to teach
Oh,
like that was amazing.
yeah.
It was amazingly hard, but at least I had gone to Colorado College, so I knew that I needed to write a whole bunch of stuff before I ever arrived. So I survived, but it was pretty tough.
Wow. Is it still tough now that you've had some more experience?
It's a little bit, I actually have to say, I loved going to Colorado College and being on the block plan, but I must say, I like teaching on the semester plan or even a trimester plan a little bit better, because I think it does help to sort of present some material, let it soak in, and then move on to the next topic. I think that time is good. The block plan is great for lots of things, but teaching, it's really intense when you're trying to prepare and teach on the block plan.
How do you work with students who have no experience in biology before? Obviously, I took Bio 181 last semester, which is meant for people with no background. So how do you teach that material versus teaching the more experienced students or working with your own research?
Mm-hmm. So a couple ways to do that. I've taught here a non-majors course. I haven't taught it in recent years, but I'm hoping to resurrect it soon. It's called Why Sex. And it's basically, it tackles the problem of the evolution of sex. And it covers a lot of the same, its goals are really to expose students to the diversity of systems out there, both animal systems and in plants and even fungi, but also to expose those students to things like, how do we know how different species are related to one another? So how, what's the evidence for common ancestors through time, and what's meiosis? What does it do? And you can teach those kinds of things without the technical terms that you need all the time, right? I mean, you can do that, and that works pretty well. And I find that students at Amherst, they don't have any problem getting into the literature and reading a particular thing. So for that non-majors course, I used to assign sort of catchy little articles that were accessible. and students would read them, but they're from the primary literature. And I think it was a good building exercise to let everybody know they really could do this, and they could understand it. And frankly, it's very rare these days for us, anybody, to read a scientific article and understand everything in it. It's just rare. It's very hard these days to do that. And so that's, I think, a good message to tell people when they're engaging with something. And then I think it's just trying to figure out what the problem is. Sometimes it's the technical terminology, and I'm as guilty as any scientist of, using technical terminology occasionally because it's easy, because, to communicate that way, but only to certain groups. And so you learn, I think, how to lose some of the terminology and focus instead on the main things that you're trying to get through to people.
Is it hard to switch between working with a more inexperienced group and a more experienced? Like, do you have to shut off a part of your brain to be able to?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Because I can read you guys pretty well. I can look at you and know if you're understanding what I'm saying, or I'll ask you a question and then it's pretty clear if you understand what I'm saying. Right? Yeah. So I've learned some strategies to help gauge my communication ability by asking questions and getting feedback from people. But I just like, and I actually would say this too about plants. I don't think there's an expectation that most students come to Amherst having studied plants in particular, right? So if I said to you, what are the major parts of a flower? Very few people who are starting in Bio 181 would be able to tell me. Mm-hmm. A few of you would, right? But, people be, oh, petals, right? And I'd be like, right, great. Petals is one of them. There's 3 others. What are they? And so.
Yeah.
And then I might say, okay, and now here's a peach. What part of the flower was that? And people say, what? That's not a flower, that's a fruit. And I'll say, yeah, but it was part of a flower. What part was it, right? And then it's easy, because then you're thinking about something that you see or touch or experience every day, and you're relating it back to the issue, that the content that you're trying to deliver.
Do you write grants ever, or grant?
Oh, yeah.
How do you do like persuasive writing for this kind of thing for that audience?
So I've had a few grants since I've been at Amherst. But when I first arrived, I wrote a grant to actually expand my studies of lithium to the world. So lithium is a worldwide group. So it's on every continent except Antarctica. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I wrote a grant and I said, look, I've learned a lot about lithium in the Southwestern United States, but it's time to start looking at this group more broadly to understand how it populated the earth, right? We know that the family that this group of plants is in is very evolutionarily young, which means that it didn't float around on continents. It's way too young. It's been dispersed from continent to continent. And so we got very interested in, well, how did that, where did the genus originate on this planet, and how did it leave from that place? And so we were really lucky. I went to South Africa with some students, 3 times with students. I went to Australia. I've been to Australia a couple of times. I've been to China with a student, been to South America, been to Mexico with students, taking them around, collecting lithium, bringing them back, isolating their DNA, building their evolutionary histories, and telling a story about how this group of plants has moved around the earth. So that was the first, I would say good 8 years of my career here at Amherst was focused on that goal.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing that you've been focused on this genus for so long.
It is funny. Like I worry, when I'm anxious, I worry that I'm going to run out of things to ask. Mm-hmm. But in reality, the more you look, the more interesting it becomes.
Wow. Do you ever get tired of one subject?
It's not really one subject. It's really branched out. So now we study sort of how this plant moves around. We study its sexual strategy. So in some cases it's separate sexes, in some cases it's hermaphroditic, in some cases it's got a population that has females and hermaphrodites. Mm-hmm. Instead of females and males. And we've also started studying self-incompatibility in this particular group of plants. So in fact, these plants cannot self-fertilize because they have a genetic system that prevents it. And so we've been very interested in the patterns of genetic diversity that underlie that particular feature. And so it's always something a little bit different. We've also been interested in chromosomal evolution. So if you think about the amount of chromosomes that you have, it turns out when lithium has separate sexes, they tend to have twice as much chromosome counts.
Oh, interesting.
So there's a very tight association between the ploidy level of a plant, how much DNA a plant species has, and whether or not it's dimorphic or hermaphroditic.
Huh.
It's fascinating. So the questions keep coming. It's a great system to work on.
How do you change your writing in a grant application to convince whatever organization that your project is worth funding?
I think, it depends a little bit who your funding agency is, right? If I was going to write a grant to the U.S. Agricultural, right, I would have a particular focus in that. I don't write grants to the USDA. I write grants to the National Science Foundation. And in general, right, the bigger hooks are the sort of larger frameworks underneath the larger framework. So for example, in lithium, there are plants that have diploid chromosome numbers, tetraploid chromosome numbers, octoploid chromosome numbers, right? There's a lot of variation in chromosome number, and chromosome number is known to affect reproduction. So for example, a diploid plant cannot usually mate successfully with a plant that has a tetraploid number. So twice 2x versus 4x, for example. And so that then, when you have diversification of those chromosome numbers, then you have an opportunity for speciation events. So a larger context here is, how do plants diversify and turn into big lineages of plants, right? How do new species form? And so you can frame the work that you do around reproductive systems under a slightly larger umbrella of, say, speciation or diversity building in groups, if that's your interests, right? Sometimes people might be interested in, this is a project we haven't actually taken on, but we're quite interested in what the genes that get turned on or off are during sexual development. So for example, if a plant is going to make a female flowers, which genes get turned on and which genes get turned off in order to make that morphology? And what do those genetic systems look like as compared to the genes that get turned on or off when you're making a hermaphrodite flower? So you can pinpoint the genes, right, that are causing those changes in morphology. That might have an applied purpose if you were imagining a crop breeder, right? You can imagine that a crop breeder might want to understand the genes that are controlling female flowers because they lead to fruits, right? And fruits are marketed. But that's not my primary focus. My primary focus is thinking about the evolution of these reproductive strategies and how they have caused speciation patterns and how evolution happens within populations. So from a very academic perspective.
I think I have time for one more question. So I'd like to know, what advice do you have for any future scientists or science communicators who are hoping to sort of follow in your footsteps?
I think being comfortable with not knowing the answer is really important. And I think recognition that not knowing the answer is not failure. And in fact, one might even argue that not knowing the answer to something is the start of something productive. So sometimes students can get really anxious when they can't figure out the answer. That's okay. That's what it's about, right? It's about identifying those moments that you don't. So trying to get comfortable with that. And that's hard because it's hard to feel confident when you don't know the answer. Mm-hmm. And so I think they're connected. So trying to find that balance in taking in knowledge and learning things with confidence to pursue things that you don't know is, I think, really important. I think these days collaborating with people is hugely important, probably even more so than when I came up, 20 years ago. I think the ability to talk to different people, to talk to different groups, to talk to people with different perspectives about maybe the same problem or the same area is just critically important. And you do that by, again, being interested, going to talks, listening to people, asking questions, all of those kinds of things. And I think that, at least for me, one of the most important things that I want to do for students, and that I continue to do for myself even, is to try to constantly cultivate an appreciation for nature and for natural, and in my case, biological systems. We have one Earth. It's a cool place. There's a lot to still study out in it, but we need to go study it, and we need to appreciate it. And I think getting out and looking at things, really good thing to do.
Oh man, you've got me all excited now. Continuing in science. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
You're more than welcome. It was fun. Annika, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Communicating Science. See you next time.